Thanks, Steve, and thanks to those of you who have come, perhaps for the first time. Some of you have returned from last night. For the benefit of those who weren't here last night and who are joining us online tonight for the first time, my name is Thiessen. I'm a sociologist of religion. I'm in my 11th year on faculty at Ambrose University in Calgary, Alberta. And as a sociologist, I come to the table, I come to you today with an emphasis on empirical data. What can empirical data do for us, perhaps to us, and how can we leverage empirical data to broaden the ways in which we think about evangelism? I care deeply about the local church. I care deeply about theological and biblical questions and how those kinds of questions intersect with the sociological work that I bring to the table tonight. And so I hold these things in tension, but also in a level of synergy as well. And I hope you will too, as you hear some of the data that I present this evening. Last night, I talked about a group of Canadians who say they have no religion, who sociologists of religion call religious nuns. This is the fastest growing Canadian group, 24% of the adult Canadian population, 28% of Canadian millennials, and 32% of Canadian teenagers. I won't walk you through everything I said last night, but I use it as the opening lecture to set the context for tonight, and that is on evangelism in Canada. What do we know from the empirical data on evangelism in Canada, both from the pulpit and the pew, and how might that inform how we engage some of what we learned last night about those who say they have no religion? On top of, alongside, in addition to my work as a sociologist of religion, I'm also the director of the Flourishing Congregations Institute. Some of the research I'm going to share tonight comes out of our work at the Institute. I'm going to share a little bit right now in the event that not everyone who's here joins us tomorrow night for various reasons, though, as I said last night, I think tomorrow night is the gem of the three. So I'll do everything I can to continue to draw you back insofar as it's safe to do so. But I want to share a few things about the Institute that will give some context for some of the comments I'll make tonight. There's much research out there on what's wrong with the church. And there's much research out there on why people are leaving the church. My own research included the meaning of Sunday, which I talked a little bit about last night, on religious nuns and others and why people are leaving the church. I think this is important research. We need to pay attention to that. But if that's all we pay attention to, I think we miss a significant story or narrative within congregational life in Canada. And it's simply this, that there are signs of life and vitality in Canadian churches. Catholic, mainline, conservative, Orthodox congregations across this country. And yet we know very little about these churches from a social scientific perspective. And so our institute exists to study congregations in Canada, which I think itself is a contribution to an area that we know relatively little about. We know lots about congregations in the United States and UK and Australia and so forth. So we're trying to contribute to that conversation. As an institute, we are at our core ecumenical. That is, we want to study and partner with congregations across the theological continuum. We are committed to empirical data. I would say this is the distinctive of the Institute, that we are contributing empirical data to the conversations that we are having about congregations. And we are pan-Canadian. That is, we are intentional in trying to gather data from coast to coast to coast in urban and rural settings and a variety of different contexts that would broaden and deepen our understanding of congregational life in Canada. So that's a little bit of what we're trying to do. I'd encourage you to check out our website. We try to provide free resources that would be of value and benefit to local churches. So you can check out the resources link there. Every 2 weeks, we share a blog from a church leader across the country, some recent academic empirical data that we're working on and so forth. So I would encourage you to sign up for those. Again, just trying to be a resource for local congregations informed by empirical data are some of the things that we are trying to do. The last thing I'll say, and this will dovetail with some of the material I'll share today, is that we're in the middle of a national congregations survey. You can see more and hear more about that on our website. Also at the back or over there by the books, you will find a little one-page sheet that will tell you about this national survey. The reason I mention it here is that we are still recruiting congregations, and we want as many congregations from as many different contexts to be involved with this. Whether or not you see yourself as flourishing, regardless of what size, denomination, local context, etc., we'd love to have different congregations, as many as possible, involved. What I'll say here in terms of, well, why would we give our time and energy to this? As an institute, we're providing free reports to every congregation who participates with data specific to your congregation, so that you can get a bit of a read on how those within your own congregation are thinking about a variety of things that we'll talk about today and tomorrow. So that's my little sales pitch, and hopefully some of the data that I share today, you'll see some of the benefit for hopefully garnering some of this data, not just in your own setting, but for some of our larger initiatives when it comes to understanding congregations. Now to the topic at hand on evangelism in Canada, from the pulpit to the pew. How do Canadians think about, practice, and respond to evangelism in Canada? This is the question I want to address, and I want to draw on a couple of different studies as it relates to the pulpit. How are church leaders addressing this? And then we'll turn to some research on those in the pews. Recently, our institute released an article. You'll see it there on the left-hand side. What is a flourishing congregation? Leader perceptions, definitions, and experiences. This article is freely available on our website. You can get it there. I'm going to draw on right now a few things that come out of that article as it relates to evangelism. This comes out of interviews that we did with 114 church leaders across the country, Catholic, mainline, conservative, Protestant leaders, as well as 9 focus groups that included about 60 or so individuals in 5 different locations across the country. And we asked them this question: when you think of a flourishing congregation, what comes to mind? And they gave us a whole range of things, which will be the topic of my lecture tomorrow evening. I want to pull out one of those things tonight, and that is evangelism. Evangelism is one of a series of things that leaders across the theological continuum identified for us was an indicator of flourishing. Of course, the sociologists and me and the social scientific training of our research team wants to probe that further and say, okay, what do you mean by evangelism? What does that actually look like in your own setting and context? And so here are some of the things, some of the ways in which leaders describe for us evangelism within their contexts and experiences. First, they described it, and again, as I share these things, I'm not calling for you to agree or disagree with these narratives, but for you just to understand how leaders are speaking of these things. Described evangelism as telling others about their Christian faith and inviting others to become a Christian and to attend church. In other words, the conception of evangelism involved both a layer of identification, for a person to identify with a particular religion, and with that to take on particular beliefs, right? For a person to invite them to become a Christian is to take on a particular identification for how they might see themselves, and ultimately to embed themselves within a faith community. That is, the behavior that one participates in, attending church and perhaps a series of other things that connect with that, is part of what they have in mind when it comes to evangelism. Perhaps later on we have some open Q&A. We might talk a little bit further about how do we measure religiosity, and is this a good marker or end goal, if you will, of evangelism. But this is how some pastors and church leaders are talking about these things. One individual says to us, quote, "When I think of flourishing, there is a real sense that people are coming to faith and are growing in their faith. This is not a static thing where you just come to faith, it's a one and done kind of thing, but this is something that is an ongoing process of, and I'll talk a little bit tomorrow about discipleship, something that we are continuously growing in." And so when we think about evangelism, it is inviting people into a starting point, however defined, as a step along a far longer process. In fact, some might talk about everyone who's sitting in the pews on a weekly basis are being evangelized or re-evangelized in different ways that are growing us further and deeper along a discipleship process. And so this narrative of discipleship comes up in the following way. One individual says, quote, Evangelistic communities have typically measured conversion, and that's a really difficult thing to play with. And so we are really looking in terms of where baptism occurs and where it occurs in a discipleship journey. And does it lead to ongoing discipleship? Again, not this one-off thing, but it's leading to a progressive process. Where there's baptism that leads to ongoing discipleship, people are flourishing, and where that's happening, lots of congregations are flourishing, end quote. Some of the ways in which people are thinking and talking about these things. Final bullet point here that I'll draw your attention to is the role and place of Alpha. It was intriguing and maybe even a little bit surprising to our team how often we heard Alpha being referenced across theological contexts. We might have expected it primarily to be discussed in conservative Protestant settings, and I don't think we expected to hear so much of it within many mainline traditions and within Catholic contexts, where Alpha was seen as a primary vehicle and mechanism by which congregations were drawing on other resources to invite people into the fellowship of their community and to educate and to teach others about their faith. And what was interesting, again, thinking about discipleship in a broad perspective here, was that Alpha was talked about not only in the sense of people who had no Christian background or no faith background who were learning about Christian values and principles, but they saw it as a discipleship process for those who were in their own congregation, who had perhaps been there for 5, 10, 15 years, who were learning anew some basic, quote unquote, beliefs and practices that were core to their religious group. This almost served as a catechism of sorts for those who were part of the group, evangelizing from within as well as out with. These were different things that came to the fore among those that we spoke to. So this is one aspect of some of the ways that those in the pulpits are talking about and thinking about evangelism. I want to turn to another research project by Dr. Sam Reimer at Crandall University out in Moncton. Many of you may know him, as well as Dr. Mike Wilkinson at Trinity Western University, and their book, A Culture of Faith. If you haven't read this book, I would highly recommend it. It's the best book on evangelical congregations in Canada. That's current, it's up to date. It provides a very broad perspective on how evangelical congregations are engaging with a whole series of matters related to evangelical subculture here in Canada. One aspect of their research deals with evangelism. And here's some of the things that come out in their survey and interview data with over 500 leaders of evangelical congregations here in Canada. They asked leaders to identify a range of topics that they preached on in their weekly gatherings. And so they asked, over the last 6 months, how frequently have you preached on a range of topics? And evangelism was preached on average, kind of 7.53 times over a 6-month period, which was the second highest topic that was preached on within evangelical settings, following devotional practices. Devotional practices was the #1 thing that was preached on, and evangelism was #2, which would suggest to us sociologically, at least in the minds of religious leaders in evangelical settings, that evangelism is an important topic, an important subject for theological reasons and other reasons within their fold. Kind of a side point, but not insignificant, was that evangelism scored well above things like sex or sexuality or money as a topic of preaching, which I think is important because many of the public perceptions, some of which we talked about last night, are that all evangelicals are concerned with is sexuality and money and these kinds of things. But in fact, when you talk to evangelical pastors, you find out that actually few of them are speaking about these topics with any degree of regularity, at least in the Canadian context. And one might want to compare and contrast these things with the United States and would probably find some pretty stark differences on these things. When they probed, when Reimer and Wilkinson probed leaders on what they meant by evangelism when they're preaching about these things, what do they have in mind? They spoke about sharing one's faith with others as an authentic expression of one's Christianity by telling others about God's love and inviting people into receiving God's love. These were some of the central conceptions of what evangelism actually meant. They then moved on to ask these leaders of the congregations about the congregational priorities. If they have a whole range of items, and said, okay, how significant are these different priorities within your congregation? So have in the background of your mind, second topic preached on most is evangelism. Now we look to congregational priorities, and we find that evangelism was ranked number 9 out of 16 different items on the list that they provided. 37% of evangelical pastors identified evangelism as a very high priority. And it trailed behind other things such as the faith development of youth and children, creating a welcoming worship service, strengthening families and marriages, and preserving traditional morals. Now, I'm not here to advance the case that evangelism should or shouldn't be more or less important. What I'm here to present is how pastors talk about these things as an important thing, and then how this plays itself out in different aspects of organizational life. And then eventually we'll see how this plays out among congregants themselves. Then they proceeded to ask about the kinds of internal programs that are offered in their congregation. And on a list of 18 different programs, evangelism ranked number 16 out of 18 in terms of programs that were offered towards either training or developing people toward evangelism, or actual evangelism-like programs, say Alpha as one example. 42% of congregations said that they had programs that were oriented towards an evangelistic focus, well below other things such as Bible study programs, children's programs, and prayer meetings that you found in over 90% of congregations. Again, not inferring that some of these are better or worse than another, but simply to show many pastors speak about evangelism frequently. The priority that is given to evangelism seems to drop a little bit down the radar. And then when you look at the actual programs, yet again, it falls even further behind. If we were to think both sociologically, but practically and theologically about how evangelism plays itself within congregational life, one ought to think about the disjunction between some of the things that we're starting to hear. This is very sociological, in some ways we are a product of the social environment that we are in. If we don't have social milieus or environments that are encouraging us and providing opportunities for the things that we hold to be true and of utmost importance, then that will, we should theoretically assume, have an impact on what is happening on the ground. So hold these things in the back of your mind. They then ask questions about external oriented programs that are offered in and through a congregation. I don't want you to get lost in all the details and all the numbers and percentages that you see here, but they're asked to identify of a range of different programs that are externally focused. In what ways would you see these as evangelistically oriented? In other words, are these strategies helpful toward your cause when it comes to evangelism? Do you intentionally pursue the following things with evangelism in mind? And so you here, and I'll just read them so you can see a list, and also pay attention to the chronological order of these things that are most frequently referenced relative to those that are least frequently referenced. Foreign missions, 83.5%, say that they intentionally pursue these things as a strategy for evangelism. An ad in a phone book or newspaper, 76.6%. Your website, 73.8%. Acts of kindness, 62.3%. Barbecues, block parties, carnivals, 60.3%. Vacation Bible School, 58.4%. Distributing flyers, 50.4%. And you see how these figures are dropping. Service in another location. So maybe you hold a service in a park or some kind of public venue, 45.8%. Bible study, small groups, 41%. Alpha, 32.8%. Door-to-door, 24.3%. And street drama or singing, 13.6%. What is one to make of this data? The conclusion, the observation that Wilkinson and Reimer offer is that, generally speaking, the types and forms of evangelism that congregations are participating in and pursuing tend to be, by and large, more of a passive variety more than an active form of evangelism. Without attaching a normative evaluation of some being inherently better or worse, there seems to be a more passive approach to evangelism versus those more aggressive / active forms of evangelism. A couple stories come to mind when I think about these things. I was at a conference in Las Vegas back in the fall with some colleagues in sociology who would identify themselves as atheists on a personal level. We're in the United States. You have to understand the social context. We're in Las Vegas. And there are some street evangelists downtown Las Vegas. Megaphones, big signs, placards, etc. And I would consider this sort of a more active form, right, of evangelism, a more aggressive form of evangelism, not as common in Canada. I'm sure there are examples in different cities across our country, but I just think about the experiences and the reflections that emerge from my colleagues who know that I'm actively involved in a local church. We have rich, vibrant discussions about the place of religion and evangelicalism and evangelism specifically within society. But you could just hear all of this negative feedback from my colleagues and peers towards what they are seeing within their setting and context. I think in part, this is why some, perhaps most, evangelical congregations and evangelicals in Canada are somewhat averse to these more aggressive, if you will, active forms of evangelism, because there is this perception, this negative perception that is very real out there for many in terms of how people respond to and engage that. A second story. When I think about Canadian evangelism approaches, I think primarily of what I'll call the passive form of evangelism. It goes something like this, that I'm going to be a nice person to you, my neighbor, my coworker, my family or friend who may not identify as Christian or be part of the tribe that I identify with. And I hope that one day you're going to ask me why I'm a nice person, right? And when you ask me why I'm a nice person, I'm going to tell you it's because I have Jesus in my heart and I have all these other wonderful things and it makes me a joyful person and make me want to do all these things. Okay. This Thursday, I will fly back, Lord willing, weather permitting, fly back to Calgary. And Thursday night, I will play floor hockey with my wife on a team that is primarily filled with individuals who do not identify as Christian, who are not actively involved in church in any way, shape, or form. This is a group that we're very intentionally part of. And when I fly back Thursday and we play floor hockey Thursday night, we've played with the same team for probably 7 years. They know that my wife and I are devoted to our Christian faith. But I couldn't tell you the last time they asked either Helen or myself why we're nice people. Which either means, if you want to follow the logic, either we're not nice people, so that could be one interpretation. We have to put that on the table. And hopefully we'll suspend that for a moment. Or it means there's actually something in this Canadian approach of, you know, we're just supposed to be nice people. And that's part of what it means either to be Canadian or just what it means to be fellow human beings. That this isn't something extraordinary that is going to compel a person to ask you a distinct question of why you're somehow nice. In fact, as I talked about last night on religious nuns, there's many nice religious nuns who do good things and do kind things. And so this raises a bit of a juxtaposition, I would suggest, practically and theologically, between the passive forms and the more active forms, and neither seem to be particularly effective. I think this is part of the quandary that we find ourselves in within a Canadian context. We don't want to be too offensive or exclusive, and yet if we're too passive, then there really is nothing that necessarily bridges the gap. These are some of the thoughts that I bring to the table as I read some of the data from the pulpit. I now want to turn my attention then to what is happening in the pews. What is happening of those who are sitting in congregations? And here I draw on this national survey data that we're in the middle of collecting. If you'll forgive me for a couple minutes, I'm going to walk you through some of the methodology and I'll explain why it's important that I do so, because it will give context for the actual data that we'll see in a moment. But we are in the middle of a national congregations survey. We have sent emails out to hundreds of leaders, denominational leaders, pastors, etc., across this country, seeking involvement of congregations of any size, any theological stripe, any context, etc., seeking to include their congregations, both their leaders and their congregants. It's really important sociologically to include both leaders and congregants because it's one thing to hear what leaders have to say, And not that we would distrust leaders for any good reason, but there's also something perhaps happening on the ground among congregants that might be very different than what we hear from leaders. And so we want to hold these two in tension, and we want to unpack those things. So that's the foreground for some of the data that I'll present today. So what I'm talking about today comes from about 2,400 individuals who are in different congregations across this country who are engaging the questions that I'll share on today. 86 congregations of the data to date that I'll present. This will probably look different 6 months from now as we move further on with our data collection. 41% of these congregations have fewer than 100 weekly attenders. This is important to note, because you may or may not know this, but most congregations in Canada have fewer than 100 weekly attenders. This is the norm. When you hear of quote unquote large churches in the thousands, even in the hundreds, that is the exception, not the norm in our country. And so this is part of what our sample reflects. Just under 10% of those who are in our sample are coming from congregations who have more than 500 weekly attenders. Largest 4 denominations that are represented so far: Christian and Missionary Alliance, Reformed, United Church of Canada, and Catholic. I'll give an honorable mention to Baptists at 9%, so just kind of missed the top 4 cut there. But so you know that there is a Baptist representation. Love to have more, around 9% as part of this sample. And there are other traditions, of course, that are included, but those are the top 4. Largest 3 provinces represented: Ontario, Alberta, and Saskatchewan. And some other demographic details important to note, that we're dealing with an older sample. 67% of those who have filled this out are over the age of 50. Which demographically, from what we know about religious trends, we know that older generations tend to be more religious than younger generations, and we know that congregations tend to follow some of these demographics, so this reflects some of the overarching trends. Smaller locations. 63% of those who have filled out this survey are coming from locations that have fewer than 250,000 people within their particular town or city. Again, with a wide range, of course, under that 250,000 threshold. But it's simply to note, we're not dealing primarily with the million-plus urban centers that you might assume would be the case. And then 81% of such congregations in this study so far have existed for 30 or more years. Now, why do I say all these things? What's the importance of mentioning these methodological things? Because when you look at data, as much as we talk about who is present in the data, you have to ask the question of who is not present in the data. Everything I'm about to say has to have an asterisk beside it of whose voices are not being heard in the data so far. And this is what we're doing as an institute and as a research team, is we're aggressively going after many of the gap areas that you don't hear of right here. Hence, I think in 6 months from now, hopefully we'll see different kinds of data, different nuances within the data that I'm about to share. And I think for those of you who are ministering in local church settings, always be careful and cautious when you're reading empirical data. Don't just jump to the findings and conclusions and take them as they are. You have to pay attention to the method and the data that contributes to those conclusions, for they provide a bit of a, I would say, a grounding for what is and isn't being said within the data. So that's my genuinely meant tipping of the hat to my discipline. I've now given you the methodological context. Now what I'm sure you really are interested in is, what do we know? And what have we learned from those who relate to evangelism? Here is an image. I don't know if you can all see it at the back there. This is on our website, and this will be the theme of my talk tomorrow, is to talk through a flourishing congregations construct. The question that we're often asked, and rightly so, is when you say flourishing congregation, what do you mean? What we mean are the 11 things that you see here, of which evangelism is one of them. I'm going to pull out evangelism for the purpose of our conversation tonight, and then you come back tomorrow night. This is the teaser. You'll hear about the other 10 things, and we'll go into detail on those things. And the way in which these different ideas emerged came from leaders that we met with across the country in the first phase of our research, who shared with us in response to that question, a flourishing congregation is. And then we distilled the thousands of pages of transcripts down to this construct that you see here. So I'm going to focus on that, that aspect of evangelism in this outward dimension. All right, on the survey. we ask respondents a whole range of questions. At the end of the survey, we include a question that says, a flourishing congregation, ... And then we give a whole series of indicators, and we're asking for them to indicate their level of agreement or disagreement. So I'm going to pull out here the one on evangelism, that a flourishing congregation practices evangelism. To what extent do you agree or disagree with this statement? The data that I'm presenting here, and I will do this for many of the charts that we'll see hereafter, have divided between three kinds or types of congregations, if you will. Upon individuals sitting in the pews, we asked them earlier in the survey whether they believe that their congregation is growing, staying the same, or declining. Okay. Now, this does not give, and it's very hard to get at this kind of data, and Dr. Stephen McMillan will know very well from his own research, when you're trying to gather data on actual church growth and decline, it's difficult to get at these figures and numbers. So what I'm presenting here in part is people's perceptions from the pews of whether their congregations are growing or declining. We have some other data from clergy within the same survey that eventually we'll be able to cross-post and cross-tabulate some of these things. But I want to highlight, for observation's sake, some of the distinctions between those who are in churches where they believe they are growing, staying the same, or declining on this question and others to follow. A flourishing congregation practices evangelism. On the left-hand side, the blue represents strongly agree, the yellow is agree. Growing, in the middle you see staying the same, and on the far right-hand side you see declining. The thing that I want to highlight here, and a consistent thread we see throughout our data, is that those who are in congregations where they believe that growth is happening are more likely to say that they believe a flourishing congregation practices evangelism. And I would say sociologically that your underlying beliefs as an organization, as a church, ought to and often do come out in the kinds of things that you do in your local congregation. If you don't believe evangelism is important, then that will translate into the kinds of things that you do or don't do in your congregation. We know from sociological literature that there are three main ways that a congregation grows. Okay? They grow from having children and retaining them. Okay, great church growth strategy, have a lot of children. And then have a great program that can help to retain your children. Number two is transfer growth. People either leave church A to attend church B, or they relocate from city A to city B and they're looking for a new church in that area. And so many churches grow out of that. And then the third is primarily from evangelism. From those who have no Christian background or no faith background or not currently tied to a religious group, this serves as one of the avenues by which congregations grow. And so if you're thinking practically and even theologically, wherever you align yourself on that continuum as you think about evangelism, if a congregation does not believe that evangelism is important to a flourishing congregation, sociologically one might argue that's one of the three legs to the stool that could potentially contribute to church growth within your own context. So this gives us a bit of a starting barometer of some differences between those who are growing versus those who are declining. All right, I would like you, if you have your phones with you or computers, whatever, you'd like to take them out. Last night we participated in an exercise. I had you engage the question of where you think we have the lowest rates of religious nuns across the country. Tonight I want to ask you a question, a personal question about your local congregation. Please know that there are no right or wrong answers. I'm not trying to inform you to answer in a particular way. I just want you to answer honestly. So I want you to go to this website, menti.com, MENTI.com. If you're watching online, you can do this as well. Once you get to that website, you can use this code 188148. And there you will come to this question. As you think about your local congregation, to what extent would you say your congregation gives priority or not to engaging in evangelism? So I'll give you some time to fill that out. In a moment, I'll take you to another slide where we'll have a look in the mirror and we'll see how you've answered this question. As you're doing that, One thing that might be helpful in your own local context, this little tool that I'm using here as a way of engaging and getting some feedback here, it's a really easy and simple tool that you can use in your own church on a Sunday morning, for example. You could ask a couple of questions and get some feedback from those in your congregation. It's a great learning tool to remember that congregations are also learning communities, and we learn in different ways and we engage in different ways. So if you find this helpful in your own setting, we've got a little one-page handout again at the back that gives you step-by-step instructions, super easy, free tool that you can use in your church. So you can grab that, and if that's helpful in your church, by all means, make use of that in your own setting. All right, I'm gonna take you to a website. Give me 1 second. And I heard myself talking back somewhere there. All right, what you're seeing here is your own responses from perhaps elsewhere in the country as people are engaging this question. What I think is important to note as you look at this data is that context matters. I've said that a number of times during my time here on campus. These responses will look differently if this was a room filled primarily of Catholics, or primarily of Presbyterians or United Church of Canada, or follow your list. So I was with a different theological tradition last week, and most of the responses were on the left side of this continuum. Most of them were low priority, somewhat a priority, or not a priority. So when you look at the mirror here today, I would expect to find, at least within a predominantly evangelical context, many of whom come from perhaps Baptist backgrounds, but not exclusively Baptist in the room here, and those who are watching, that you would expect to find a bit more of a response among that middle to right-hand side. I think this question is important because it gives you a sense, and it gives perhaps your own context a sense of how do people think about these things on the ground within your congregation. You might be a church leader who believes that your church gives great priority to evangelism. But if you ask this question on Sunday morning and you utilize this tool, I think it might be interesting, perhaps scary, I don't know, what kind of data comes back to you. I think data is really important so that you aren't inferring things that aren't actually there, but you're getting a really good picture of what is actually there. And so I use this as a, hopefully an interactive way for you to see and get a pulse of those who are sitting around you in engaging these things. All right, let's go to the survey then and see how people answered this question. All right, our congregation prioritizes evangelism. Now I'm making some distinctions here again between growing, staying the same, and declining congregations. How do they respond to these questions? On the left-hand side, that blue category represents those who say their congregations give a high or essential priority to evangelism, and that yellow bar below it gives somewhat or moderate priority. Again, and consistent with the thesis that I advanced earlier, and I will build here in the remainder of our time, those in growing congregations are more likely to say that their congregation gives a higher priority to evangelism than those in either congregations that are staying the same or declining. And in particular, when you look at that blue line, that there's a significant difference, just looking at basic descriptive data here between these three categories, between growing and staying the same and declining congregations. We then wanted to probe different ways in which people might actually evangelize. I talked earlier about these active and passive forms of evangelism, so we provided different questions that would tap into that to see, okay, how are people actually behaving, or how do they say they're behaving when it comes to these things? We asked a question about how frequently do you verbally share your faith? And when we talk about verbally sharing your faith, we're talking specifically about sharing your faith with someone who you believe does not identify as Christian, with the purpose of drawing them further into potentially identifying and becoming involved within Christianity and a Christian community. The blue line at the top represents those who verbally share their faith daily. That yellow line below is weekly. The middle gray bar is monthly. The next section is annually, and the green at the bottom is never. a few things that stand out to me as I look at this data. First, if we look at the blue and the yellow at the top, the daily and weekly, you find that this is more commonly found among those who say they're part of growing congregations versus those who are in declining congregations. This is consistent with the thesis that I've developed so far. Conversely, if you look at the very bottom on those green lines, and you look at the far right-hand side in those declining contexts, you find that 16% in declining congregations versus 8% in growing congregations say that they never share their faith. These different aspects of the continuum, I think, give us insight into the frequency with which people are verbally sharing their faith, and how I would suggest there are distinctive subcultures within growing congregations versus declining congregation when it comes to these things. Think back to what we heard from the pulpit, how frequently evangelism is talked about. If we were to parse that question out between growing and declining congregations, my hypothesis would be that we would find those things talked about more frequently in growing congregations versus declining. And that's probably some of what we're seeing among congregants in this chart. We're going to come back to this image in a moment. Verbally sharing your faith, a more active form of evangelism, if you will. How frequently do you show your faith to others with actions? What stands out to me here is that there's virtually no difference between growing and declining congregations, and that you see a massive spike here, particularly in that blue section of doing so daily, but also in that weekly category of doing so on a weekly basis. Now, I mean, this may not be seen for those who are watching online, but I'm going to go back and forth between these two slides. I'm going to show those of you here in person to look at the difference between the blue and yellow lines. Verbally sharing your faith, the blue and yellow at the top, and showing your faith to others with actions. It is a massive difference. Think about the floor hockey example that I gave earlier. It seems to be that many seem comfortable with showing their faith through actions rather than verbally telling their faith and sharing their faith verbally with others. And I think this again reveals on the ground this distinction that we are making within congregations, that I think there's this aversion, this fear of offending others. If you were here yesterday, if you listened to the lecture yesterday, I shared the example of being on the airplane, right? And the individual beside me telling me that we shouldn't push our faith onto others and that we have this strong aversion to that. This impacts those who are sitting in the pews, because we're aware of this perspective that is out there within Canadian society, and I would suggest it actually translates into our actual behaviors or lack thereof, that we take a more passive form of evangelism in this way. And I don't mean passive in any kind of evaluative or derogatory way, that it's therefore less good, less beneficial, but it is a different form as I think people are engaging the culture around them. How frequently do you invite non-Christians to your church? This is certainly not the end-all and be-all of evangelism. This is not the sole marker of whether you are evangelizing to others, but I think sociologically it's an important question, because we know, and I've referenced this before, that the number one reason a person joins a religious group is because someone personally invites them to join that religious group, which includes, among other things, inviting them to attend religious services with you alongside other activities that your faith community is part of. So on the far top, it's so small, which is a telling sign. Those who do so daily, yellow, weekly, that gray bar, monthly, and then the largest bars are near the bottom of those who invite on an annual basis or never at all. Two things I want to observe here. The first is that those who do so annually are more likely to do so in congregations where they believe that their congregation is growing versus those who are declining. Now, I'm not sure to tell you whether you should do it annually or monthly or weekly or daily. What you see here, it's clear that very few are doing so on a frequent basis from sort of the top of those. But if we draw on that annual basis, it's more common, even on a monthly basis within those who are growing. Conversely, when you look at the green bar at the bottom, those who are never inviting others, you see over 1 in 2 in declining congregations on the far right-hand side are never inviting people to their church. If you think about what's being said from the pulpit, of what is potentially important as one theological value within different traditions. If you think about one of the markers of a flourishing congregation, if you think about one of those three avenues by which a congregation might grow, this is a telling sign of some of the differences one might draw upon between congregations that are growing and those that are not. I should say parenthetically, and I'll develop this tomorrow, that I'm not for a moment inferring that flourishing congregations entails numeric growth. There's lots of discussion about that among sociologists of religion, lots of discussion about that within congregational settings. And so I don't mean to lead you down the path that if you're growing, you therefore are flourishing. There are many examples of congregations that are growing that are not flourishing, and I'll unpack what I mean tomorrow. And there are also examples of congregations that are perhaps declining numerically, where there are many signs of life and vitality, and for reasons beyond the control of the local church are contributing to the declines that are at work there, that flourishing can still take place there. So don't equate those two with one another per se. All right, we then asked congregants to identify, we gave them a whole list of what would you say are the top 3 most effective forms of evangelism within your church. So we gave them this list, we said identify the top 3. What I've done here is I've taken the 5 things that were mentioned most frequently among this lengthy list of strategies for evangelism. Now, as I present these things, and this is an important sociological distinction, these are simply congregants' perceptions of what they believe to be effective forms of evangelism. This does not actually tell us if these are effective forms of evangelism, and I'll say more about those things in a moment. But these are their perceptions, and this is important because if you're leading a congregation, you have to know how people in your congregation are perceiving the world. You have to know how you frame the discussions and how you frame the things that you're doing relative to what you believe are the core objectives for your church. So children, family, and youth ministries, almost 50% identified this. These numbers will not add up to 100 because they could indicate more than one option. Small groups, 26.2%. Women's ministries, 24.9%. Special occasions, religious holidays, and rites of passage. So you know when your church is full on Christmas Eve and Easter, you often think about these as evangelistic opportunities whereby people are coming for the only time in the year. And so target such opportunities to be crystal clear on the gospel message, as if we shouldn't do that to the other 50 weeks of the year, but this is one that we particularly focus our attention and energy on. And then Alpha at 19.9%. Whether or not these are efficient or not, or effective forms of evangelism, this is telling you that these are some of the areas that congregations are giving their time and energy into. And I would say, building on some of the things I talked about yesterday on religious nuns when it comes to children, families, and youth ministries, we know that it is relatively rare for a person to convert or to change religious allegiances or affiliation in their adult life. It doesn't mean it doesn't happen, and there is good research that shows that there are examples where it does happen, and perhaps you have anecdotal stories where that happens, but it's relatively rare. The norm is the religious affiliation and level of involvement that you have during your teenage years in particular, more or less maps closely with where you finish at the end of your life. There might be some ebb and flow over the course of your life, but we generally finish where we start if we use that starting point during our teenage years. And as I noted yesterday, the family is a really important piece of that. It is the most important piece. Congregations can come alongside in helping to support and equip families toward that end. But this seems to be an area that congregations are giving significant attention to. We then asked individuals to identify for you on a personal level, what would be the top 3 challenges for you when it comes to evangelism? So now we're not talking about the congregational level, we're asking you as an individual, what are the top 3 challenges for you when it comes to evangelism? Here are the 5 things that are mentioned most frequently among those within this sample. Lack of confidence, 46.5%. Fear of rejection, 31.5%. Increasing antagonism or resistance to Christian values in the Christian church at 31.2%. Few non-believers as friends, 28.8%. And lack of training, 19.3%. We could probably spend half an hour unpacking this and what this means. And I'm cognizant of both my own training as a sociologist, that I'm not a practitioner and I don't want to pretend to be a practitioner. I'm not a church leader. I don't lead a congregation, but I have some questions that I would ask to practitioners for consideration when I look at these kinds of things. I might ask questions such as, how do we engage and equip and empower those within our congregation when it comes to evangelism in light of the different obstacles and challenges that those who are sitting in the pews say that they confront when it comes to evangelism? What does it look like to develop one's confidence in the area of evangelism? Why do people lack the confidence? What is the fear of rejection? Sociologically, I think the fear in part is that to identify and to be actively involved within a religious group, particularly conservative forms of religiosity who tend to be more actively supportive of evangelism efforts, there is a fear of rejection from family members, from friends, from coworkers, from neighbors, etc. How do we engage those who are sitting in our pews who fear the social stigma and rejection? How do we frame those discussions in a theologically robust and significant way? Few non-believers as friends. I would say, if I were to dip my toes into the theological waters, that it's very difficult, and I would suggest problematic, for someone to identify as evangelical and to not have non-believer friends. If one believes in the evangelical impetus and message to go therefore and share the good news, one should probably ask, who are you there for sharing the good news with if you don't have non-believer friends? So what does that look like in the ways in which we engage discussions with our congregations about the social ties and networks that we have? What role and place does that have within the individual's life? These are just some ponderings. I don't necessarily have answers. I probably have more questions, and maybe some good discussion afterwards will lead to what this means in some practical and tangible ways. All right, the final piece of data, and some of this might be small to read, and so I'll read this out. And this for me is the most fascinating piece of data. And then I'll conclude with some final reflections, and then we'll open up for some Q&A and discussion. Where do people who are sitting in the pews actually come from? By that I mean, are we dealing with people who are primarily converts who are sitting in the pews? Are we dealing primarily with people who are born and raised within that particular congregation? Are we dealing primarily with transfer growth? I'm going to talk through these, and this will give us a picture of all those evangelism things that we've talked about before, whether that's actually translating to converts, so to speak, within the pews. So the blue category at the top represents individuals who used to attend a parish or congregation regularly. We don't define regularly. We leave it open-ended for a person to interpret on their own. They stopped attending regular services for a period of time, and they have since returned to regular mass or church attendance. These might be the individuals who used to attend into their teenage years. Perhaps they stopped for a period of time. It might be 1 year, it might be 20 years, and now they've returned. In other words, they have some kind of Christian background or affinity and involvement in a group. They went through a period of time of not attending, and now they have returned. This is the blue category. You see differences on the left between growing to declining on the right. Depending on your theology, you may or may not interpret such a group as a convert of sorts. You might see this as an evangelistic win, if you will. You may not. It depends on how you interpret evangelism and what that entails. The second line, the yellow line, this is the first parish or congregation of any Christian tradition that I have ever attended. It is the smallest bar, is the thinnest bar, but this in the strictest sense would represent evangelism among those who have no faith background, specifically Christian background, for whom this is the first church they have ever attended. The gray bar in the middle came to this parish or congregation after relocating to the area. So you used to live in Vancouver, you attended a church there, now you live in Halifax and you're looking for a church to attend here. This is a kind of transfer growth, albeit from geographic relocation. So you see this broad band and swath of individuals there. Fourth, came to this parish or congregation from another in the area. the same city or town. You left this church and you started going to that church. We don't unpack the reasons for why a person did that. We just track here that they have left the church and they are now attending the current church that they are part of. And then finally, raised in this parish or congregation in that bottom green line. A few observations that I would make here. First, if we were to look at that blue and yellow at the top, and let's say if we take a fairly generous interpretation of evangelism, even of those who were not actively involved in a religious group or Christianity specifically, and who have become more involved in congregational life, you will find that we are dealing with roughly 10 to 16% of individuals who are sitting in congregations who we might say have come from outside the faith tradition, or at least recently were not actively involved in a Christian community of faith, who now are. And that 10%, a little bit smaller in the declining context, the 16% in growing, a little bit larger. This is basically consistent with other data that we see, that in most congregations, doesn't mean all congregations, but at most congregations, we might say around 10% of those in the pews we might consider to be converts. Everyone else has either been born and raised within that church or is transferred into that church, either from another within the city or from another city who have relocated. So evangelism and conversion is not the primary source of many of these congregations. Now, you remember when I started today and I shared, for some of you, might be the boring methodological thing of who's included in this study? You also have to ask yourself who's not included in this study. Will this data change if we have younger church plants, for example, who are part of this? I would love to have hundreds of church plants part of this survey. I'd love to do just a distinct study and report on church plants in Canada. Is there something different about those congregations versus those that have been around for 30 plus years? Is there something distinctive? There's some hypotheses out there, but we don't actually know unless we get good data. Hence, we're trying to make some headway on these things. The second observation I would make in looking at this data pertains to that green line at the bottom, declining versus growing. It's interesting that 1 in 4 within declining congregations were born and raised more or less within those congregations. There are great strengths and weaknesses to all kinds of congregational sources and members. One of the potential drawbacks of those who are born and raised within the very same congregation is a resistance to change and a resistance to new things. We see this in organizations of many kinds. Universities are no different. The longer us faculty members are around a given institution, the harder it is for us to change or want to change policies despite what administrators want us to do, right? This can be a problematic thing for organizational change in a university setting, just like you find in congregational settings. And I think sometimes when we talk about flourishing, these are some of the dynamics and tensions that are at work here. The third and final thing I'll say about this chart, the fact that the largest lines are in the middle of those transfer sources of growth, intersects with, and this is a teaser for how we define flourishing we talk about tomorrow, intersects with the discussion of numbers and flourishing. Because a congregation is growing numerically, does that therefore mean that it is flourishing? Well, it depends in part on what you hold to be true and of greatest value within congregational life. The honest to goodness truth is that most congregations that are growing in our country are growing because of transfer growth. And it is up to you to determine whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing, whether that's a sign of flourishing or not a sign of flourishing. Is a congregation that grows primarily due to conversion and evangelism a stronger form of flourishing versus those who are growing primarily due to transfer growth? I'm not inferring one or the other, but these are the kinds of questions that I think church leaders are raising with us as we're spending time talking with them. And I think now we're getting to the point where we have some empirical data to actually test some of these assumptions. I want to dispel the inference that just because congregations are growing, that they're growing because they're effective at evangelism. I don't think this is necessarily the case. We're going to lean into that more heavily as we move further into this research. And yet it's often the narrative that I would say some large churches have internally. We're growing because we're very effective at doing these kinds of things. And it's also the narrative that those in smaller congregations have about the larger congregations. They're growing because of all these things. And I'm not sure that these things are necessarily true. So to conclude, and then we'll open up for some questions and discussion. There are notable differences, I would say, as we look at the data so far between growing and declining contexts in both the importance and the behaviors that are associated with evangelism. Sociologically speaking, we would say there are distinctive subcultures that are present in these different congregational settings that either encourage or at least don't create a space or place for evangelism to be encouraged. And yet, within that, we see this strong polarity between those who are verbally sharing their faith, of which it's a small group, and those who prefer to show their faith through their actions. These more active forms of evangelism, I would say, of verbally sharing your faith, of inviting people to the church, is still relatively small. Even though it's more common in growing versus declining contexts, it still is less common than these more passive forms of evangelism. And I would suggest that mirrors what we see happening from the pulpit, as we saw earlier, in the ways in which these things are being presented in settings, in congregational settings. And so some questions for you to consider, both of a practical and theological and biblical variety in your own context. What is the centrality of evangelism in your congregation? If you think back to the question that we all engaged in earlier on online here, how much of a priority would you say you give to evangelism or not? The priority that you give will give the initial litmus test of how central these things should or shouldn't be in your own mind and that of your congregation. How much time and energy do you give to teaching about evangelism? And by here, I mean not just teaching that evangelism is important, if that's what you believe, but also teaching in the form of equipping. Are we equipping people to evangelize within modern day contemporary Canadian context, mindful of all the perceptions that are out there toward Christianity, toward religion, toward evangelicals, toward evangelicalism and evangelism? What does it mean to be equipped to minister effectively? When I look at those different barriers and concerns that I highlighted earlier, I think much of those are fueled by a lack of equipping in the minds of individuals. There might be a willingness, but there's a lack of know-how when it comes to evangelism. What does our church have to offer in our congregational settings for individuals? Do we provide opportunities for these things to happen? I suspect there's strong reservation of going door to door. I'm not saying you should or shouldn't do that, but I think different opportunities such as Alpha, for example, provide a mechanism, a structure, a process by which the congregation can provide an avenue for individuals to partner with and to invite their friends into, where individuals are not necessarily reinventing the wheel, but are latching onto an opportunity that congregations are offering. Do we celebrate when people come to faith in and through the ministry of our congregation? This is important sociologically, because when you share stories and when you tell stories, what you're doing is you're both reinforcing for the new convert a momentous occasion that they have taken, a change of identity and sorts that helps to cement that identity transition for them. But you're also sending a signal to the rest of the congregation that this is something that we prize and value as something important. And so we want to continuously bring forward to you examples of people who are coming to faith. Why? Because we believe that this is important. And one of the things we know from sociological research is that your converts tend to be your strongest evangelists as well. That your converts tend to be, as they're learning the new faith, the new beliefs and practices, tend to be all in with both feet. And they tend to be the ones on the front line. So I think about our own church context back home in Calgary, and I think about those who have come to faith in and through our Alpha program. They're the ones who are on the front lines, who are leading and running Alpha. They're the ones who are organizing all kinds of initiatives. And I think it can actually serve as an energizing catalyst in the life of the local congregation. And so creating spaces and places for celebration has multiple benefits. And then last, do you measure anything related to evangelism? And if so, what do you measure? And do you track things over time? If you believe evangelism is important, then how do you know if you are accomplishing that goal or end? Do you measure whether it's conversions, baptisms, whatever those different markers are? And if you come to the end of the year and you see a big ledger of zeros beside it, what does that mean for the ways in which you answer some of the questions above? How do you engage in those things? And do you see progress over the course of time? I would say that congregations that are flourishing are also monitoring and measuring things along the way. There are regular checkups of sorts upon the things that they believe are important. And so I simply throw the question out there, are you measuring things? What are you measuring? Are you paying attention to those things? Because the numbers do not lie, I would suggest. They will reveal something about this area without inferring that this is easy, simple. I don't take any of those things for granted, but I think it gives us a healthy look in the mirror of what is or is not taking place. So with that, I will conclude and we'll open it up for some questions. Thank you.